Welcome to my introductory grammar course for those wanting to learn Latin. My name's Nicholas Oulton and I'm going to be guiding you through the essential grammar you need in English to help you make sense of the Latin course. And we're going to begin with a section on verbs. Now, verbs, I'm sure you know, but I'm not going to assume anything just so that we don't have any misunderstandings along the way. A verb is a doing word. That's the way we were always taught about it. A verb is a doing word. So if one is doing anything, and that could be sitting or eating or running or fighting or calling or building, anything like that, that one is doing, that is a verb. A verb has persons and numbers. It's got 3 persons and it's got 2 numbers. Okay, so what do I mean by that? A verb has 3 persons, which are first person, second person, and third person. And it's got 2 numbers, which are singular, meaning just one, and plural, meaning more than one. So in the first person singular, we are referring to I. In the second person singular, we are referring to you. In the third person singular, we are referring to he or she or it, somebody else. And then those persons move into the plural as follows. So the first person plural is we. We are learning Latin together. We are learning English grammar together. The second person plural is you, all of you, and the third person plural is they. So all of them over there, they are learning about verbs. So the next thing you need to know is that verbs always have a subject. The subject is the person or the thing doing the verb. So if you have a sentence like, Lucy is eating, the subject of the verb is eating is Lucy. She's the one doing it. And in the first person singular, we might say, I am talking. I am the subject. Second person singular, you are listening. The subject of that sentence is you. In the third person singular, she is sleeping. The subject of that verb is she. We are running. All of us, we are running. And the subject of that verb is we. Second person plural, you are running away. All of you. The subject of that verb is you. And finally, they are wondering what's going on. The subject of the verb wondering is they. Moving on from that concept, the subject of a verb in the first person or second person will always be a pronoun. The pronoun I for first person singular, you for second person singular, we for first person plural, or you for second person plural. So the subject of a verb which is either first person or second person will always be a pronoun. In the third person, however, the subject of the verb can either be a pronoun like he or she or it or they, those are pronouns, or it can be a noun or more than one noun. So for example, in the third person singular, I could say Toby is asleep, or I could say he is asleep. The subject of that verb is would either be a noun such as Toby or a pronoun such as he. Similarly, in the plural, one could say Bijan and Marcus are sailing across the sea. The subject of that verb are sailing would be the 2 nouns Bijan and Marcus, both of them together are sailing, or we could use a pronoun and say they are sailing. So far we're happy with the concept of a verb being a doing word, a verb having persons and numbers, a verb having a subject. So far, so good. The next thing we need to know is that verbs have tenses. The present, which tells us what is happening now, the future, which tells us what will happen in the future, and the past, which tells us what was happening, or what happened, or what has happened. Depending on precisely what it is we're trying to express, there is also a distinction between a simple verb and a continuous one. So, for example, the present simple tense is when we say something like, I read books. The present continuous tense, however, is when you say, I am reading a book. That tells us what I am doing now. There's a sense of it being a continuous action in the present that is going on. I am reading a book, which is different from the simple form, I read books. In the future, there is the future simple tense, I will go to school tomorrow. And there is the same idea of a future continuous, when you might say something like, I will be going to school every day next week. So sort of continuous action in the future. And finally, in the past, there is a simple past, such as I ate my supper. There's a continuous past, such as I was watching television for 4 hours yesterday. And there is a perfect past, which is when you say something like, I have lost my dog. A little bit more on that distinction in the past between the simple and the continuous and the perfect forms. This is going to be very important later on when we try and apply this to Latin. But the simple past tells us simply an action that happened in the past and which is now finished. It's over and done with. Yesterday, I lost my dog. And as far as anyone is concerned, listening to this sad tale, my dog is still lost. If you then asked me what I was doing yesterday at the time of the tragedy with the dog, I might say, yesterday I was walking through the woods near my house. Okay, so I'm talking about a continuous action in the past. I was walking through the woods. And then there is this idea of a perfect tense, confusingly sometimes referred to as the present perfect. But what this tense does is to describe an action that happened in the past, the results of which continue to apply in the present. Going back to the whole dog scenario, you might say to me, why are you looking so sad? And I might reply, I have lost my dog. I have lost my dog. Something happened in the past, which was the losing of the dog, but the point about it is that that dog is still lost. I have lost my dog and have still lost my dog. My dog is still lost. Another little thing we just want to touch on is the whole area of auxiliary verbs. There are a number of auxiliary verbs in English. I'm going to talk about 3 of them. The verb to be, the verb to do, and the verb to have. Okay, these 3 verbs are really useful for changing slightly the nature of a verb that we are using, typically from a simple form into either a continuous or a perfect form. So I'll give you an example of that. The present tense in English of a verb like to read. I read books. You read books. He, she, or it reads books. We read books. You read books. They read books. There's our verb to read in English. If, however, you want to change that simple present tense into a continuous present tense, you're going to need help. And the help comes from an auxiliary verb, in this case the verb to be, and we end up using the verb to be along with the verb to read to give I am reading, you are reading, he is reading. So you can hear there we've got two verbs going on. We've got I am, you are, he is, we are, you are, they are, that verb to be, used in conjunction with a form of the verb to read. I am reading, you are reading, he is reading. That gives us the present continuous tense in English, and it's by using the auxiliary verb to be with the verb to read. Another auxiliary verb that can be really useful is the verb to do, and this comes in handy if you want to create a sort of emphatic form of the present tense. So, for example, you might say to me, I don't believe you ever go swimming. And I might say, I do go swimming. I go on Thursdays. Or I might say, she does go swimming. She goes on Fridays. The verb to do has come in as an auxiliary verb to create this sort of emphatic form of the present tense. It's also really useful when you want to make that tense negative. So, for example, I might want to say, I do not go swimming. I do not read books. I do not have a dog. I can't create a negative in English without the use of that auxiliary verb do. If I want to say I have a book, that's fine. But if I want to say I don't, not negative, the only way in English we can do that is to say I do not have a book. So there's the auxiliary verb do being used with the verb have to create the negative of the verb have. I do not have. Auxiliary verbs, we don't even know we're using them because it's just our language and that's the way we speak. If you hear a foreigner who's recently learnt English, they will often make a mistake which is to say, for example, I not have a book. We know exactly what they mean. I not have a book. We know it means they don't have a book. But because they haven't quite grasped the nature of the use of an auxiliary verb with the main verb, they end up saying something which, although we understand what they mean, it isn't quite correct English. Okay, so there's two uses of do as an auxiliary verb. One to emphasize that I do have a book, and the other, almost the reverse of that, to create a negative. I do not have a book. And the third auxiliary verb I want to talk about is the verb to have. This is used when you want to create the perfect tense of another English verb. So, for example, the dog scenario creeps up again. When we say, I have lost my dog, we're using the auxiliary verb to have with the English verb to lose, a part of the English verb to lose, to create a tense, the perfect tense, which is made up of I have and lost. Incidentally, that little word to I'm using a lot in front of a verb. I'm talking about the verb to be, the verb to have, the verb to do. When we put the word to in front of a verb in that way, we are using the present infinitive of the verb. Remember that phrase, the present infinitive. It's sort of like a label for the verb. If you're trying to wonder where the verb is, which verb have I lost? I've lost the verb to be, the verb to do, the verb to eat, the verb to run. The word to in front of the verb creates a grammatical structure called the present infinitive, and that's going to be very useful for us later on. Finally then, before we leave the subject of verbs, I just want to talk a little bit about conjugating. Okay, now verbs conjugate, and what I mean by that is when you go through their persons and numbers from first person singular all the way down, second person singular, third person singular, first person plural, second person plural, third person plural, when you do that, you are conjugating the verb, and verbs actually fit in groups which are called conjugations. In English we're quite lucky. We don't often see any change when we conjugate a verb. In modern languages, as you conjugate verbs, the ending of the word actually changes quite significantly. You'll see the spelling of the word change as the last few letters change as you conjugate it. In English, we're very lucky because we almost never make a change in the spelling of a word when we conjugate it, with one exception. And the exception is in the third person singular. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but in the third person singular of an English verb, I'm going to say always, I don't know if I'm right, I'm going to be brave and say always, we always add an S. So for example, we'll just crack on with the verb to read. I read, you read, he or she reads. You add an S. It then falls away again. We read, you read, they read. And we'll just see that happen with pretty well every verb. I swim, you swim, he swims. We swim, you swim, they swim. I sleep, you sleep, he sleeps. We sleep, you sleep, they sleep. We're adding an S in the third person singular. You can hear it, and of course you see it when you spell the verb out. If the verb began life ending in a vowel, like the verb to go, then you don't just add an S, you add an E and an S. So I go, you go, he goes. We've actually added ES. If the verb ends in a Y, like I fly, then you're actually going to add an I and an E and an S. So I fly, you fly, he flies. But the basic idea is in the third person singular of an English verb, when you get into the third person singular, you add an S. This is in the present tense that I'm talking about. The other area that you can see conjugating working in English is with the very irregular verb to be. So that verb actually conjugates I am, you are, he is, we are, you are, they are. So the form of the verb is changing as it moves through the persons, and that changing progression down the verb is called conjugating it. Okay, that is plenty enough, I think, on verbs for now. Next time we're going to have a look at nouns, and then as we move through the course we're going to be covering nouns, adjectives, prepositions, adverbs, a whole load of stuff. We've got a link here to the simple grammar course that we're following here. It's actually running alongside the So You Really Want to Learn Latin course. Hit the bell below if you want to subscribe to notifications when new videos come out. We're going to be launching new videos every Friday, and look forward to seeing you next time.